I never thought the world would end like this. Not with a bang, not with fire raining from the skies, but with a sickness that twisted people into something unrecognizable. The news called it a viral neurological event at first, then a rage variant, but the streets called it what it really was, the zombie plague. I was a mechanic by trade, but more than that, I was a man who had spent years quietly preparing for the day everything we knew might collapse. People called me paranoid, even my brothers sometimes, but I knew better. I had been stocking, planning, and saving for something like this. And that's how I ended up owning a relic of the Cold War, a decommissioned missile silo in the middle of nowhere. The place was a beast, built for war, abandoned after. I had bought it cheap, years back, when the government decided to wash its hands of those old underground tombs. It was a wreck when I first saw it: rusted steel, collapsed concrete in places, dripping pipes, and the smell of damp metal everywhere. But where other people saw a ruin, I saw a fortress. I poured every extra dollar I made at the shop into fixing it up. Welders, filters, old diesel generators I rebuilt with my own hands. I scrounged, traded, and worked until I had turned it into something livable. Bare bones, sure, but livable. My little insurance policy against the end of the world. When the first reports came on the radio about riots in the cities, I didn't waste time. I loaded up the truck with what I could from the house tools, food, spare parts, cans of fuel, and called my brother, Mike. He thought I was being dramatic until the day his neighbor tore his own dog apart with his teeth. That convinced him quick enough. He had a wife, Carla, and 2 kids, 12 and 9. They all piled into their SUV with whatever they could carry and met me on the road. By the time we reached the silo, the highways behind us were already clogged with wrecks and fires. Getting them down into the silo was like dragging people into a grave. I could see it in their eyes, the unease, the weight of going underground, away from the sun, into steel and concrete. The silo was never meant for comfort. The air was cool and carried the faint tang of iron, the lights were bare bulbs strung along pipes, and the rooms I had made habitable were simple: cots, shelves, storage drums. But it was safe. At least, safer than anywhere else. That first week was quiet. Too quiet. We sat in the control room listening to the radio crackle with fragments of news. Cities burning, governments falling, the military pulling back. Then nothing but static. The kids whispered to each other at night when they thought we were asleep, asking if their friends were still alive. Carla tried to make meals out of the canned goods I had stockpiled: beans, rice, powdered eggs, but there was only so much you could do with rations. Mike and I spent our days checking the systems, the generators, the fuel tanks, the air filtration units I had scavenged and rigged. It gave us something to do, something to keep us from thinking too hard about the world outside. The first real problem came with the air. I had retrofitted old filters from industrial systems, layered with charcoal and HEPA units, but they weren't designed to run 24/7 for weeks on end. One morning, I woke up to a sour smell, like something chemical in the air. I went down to the filter chamber and found the fans straining. The filters clogged with dust and grime. We had to shut the system down, swap out filters, clean what we could. For hours, the air in the silo was heavy and stifling. Sweat rolled down our backs as we worked in that narrow, echoing chamber. The kids complained of headaches. Carla paced, muttering about suffocation. It was a wake-up call. This place wasn't invincible. It would hold, but only if we fought for every breath of air it gave us. Water was another beast. I had a rain catchment system topside, piped down into storage tanks, with ceramic filters to clean it. But rain didn't come often enough, and when it did, it wasn't always clean. The first storm washed ash and dirt into the system, clogging the filters. We ended up boiling pot after pot of water on the diesel stove, letting it cool before filling jugs. It was slow, exhausting work. Every drop mattered. The kids learned quick not to waste a sip. On the surface, the world rotted. Once or twice, I ventured up through the blast doors, carrying my rifle, just to see. The first time I stepped outside, the silence hit me. No cars, no birds, nothing but the wind whistling through weeds that had already begun to creep over the cracked concrete. The farmhouse nearby was burnt to the ground, black timbers still smoldering. Farther off, I saw movement of figures staggering along the tree line, slow and jerky. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. I knew what it was. I closed the hatch behind me that night and told the others we weren't leaving unless we had no choice. But no choice came quicker than I thought. Supplies ran low. The kids needed more than canned beans, and fuel for the generators was dwindling. I had stashed drums of diesel, but even with careful use, they wouldn't last forever. After 2 weeks, I told Mike we had to make a run. He didn't argue. He just loaded his shotgun and nodded. We drove the truck out at dawn, when the world was still gray and hushed. The roads were broken by abandoned cars, some with doors hanging open, some smeared with dried blood. We passed a gas station, its windows shattered, shelves stripped bare. At the edge of town, we found a hardware store that hadn't been completely picked clean. I broke the lock with a crowbar, and we loaded up on filters, batteries, hand tools, anything we thought we could use. Mike found a stack of water jugs still wrapped in plastic. We carried them out like treasure. That's when we heard it, the low moan, the shuffle of feet. They came from between the cars, out of the alleyways, eyes glazed and mouth slack, arms reaching. Not a horde, but enough to kill us if we weren't careful. I raised my rifle and took the first shot. The crack echoed through the dead town, and more shapes began to stir. Mike fired too, the roar of his shotgun tearing the silence apart. We backed toward the truck, dropping supplies, hearts pounding. One of them, a woman in a tattered dress, lunged at me. Her skin was gray, lips torn, eyes milky. I shoved her back with the rifle stock and pulled the trigger. She dropped, and I didn't let myself look too long. We slammed the truck doors shut and tore out of there, the tires squealing on broken pavement. Back at the silo, the others waited in silence as we hauled the supplies down. Carla's eyes were wide, the kids clung to her legs. I tried to act steady, to show them we had control, but inside, my hands were still shaking. I knew then that every trip outside would be a gamble. Sooner or later, luck would run thin. Nights were the worst. The silo groaned and shifted as the wind howled above. The kids had nightmares, waking up screaming about shadows in the tunnels. Sometimes, I thought I heard scratching, faint but real, echoing through the maintenance shafts. I told myself it was just rats. But deep down, I wasn't sure. 2 weeks turned into a month. We settled into routines, rationing food, checking systems, trying to keep the kids occupied with old books and makeshift games. The air grew stale at times, and we'd have to swap filters again. The water system clogged more than once. Every repair felt like patching a sinking ship, but we kept going, because we had to. The alternative was unthinkable. Then came the day the scratching wasn't just in my head. I was in the lower maintenance tunnel, checking a pipe, when I heard it clear as day, something scraping against the steel hatch at the far end. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails on metal. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling on the riveted wall. Then came a thud. Another. Something was out there, trying to get in. My blood turned cold. I backed away, every nerve screaming to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I sealed the inner hatch and climbed back up, trying not to show the fear on my face when Mike asked what was wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. The hum of the generator echoed through the silo like a restless heartbeat. Every creak, every vibration in the steel walls felt magnified in the dark. I lay on my cot, staring at the low ceiling of the room I had turned into my quarters, listening to my own breath. My brother's family slept in the adjoining chamber, his wife and their 2 kids bundled together, their soft murmurings barely audible through the thick concrete partitions. I envied their ability to drift into sleep so quickly, as though nothing outside could touch them. For me, the weight of it all pressed down harder at night. The silence between the mechanical noises made space for my mind to spin with what-ifs. Morning came with the smell of stale air. I was the first one awake, as usual. I made my way to the control room where the old ventilation fans sat. I'd already retrofitted some of them with modern motors, but the duct system itself was ancient, scarred from decades of disuse. I flipped the switches and listened as the fans coughed to life. A rattling vibration shook the ducts before the low drone evened out into a steady, groaning whir. Fresh air was something we couldn't take for granted down here, not with so many bodies sharing limited space. I'd set up filters, carbon layers with cloth pre-filters that I washed regularly, but I worried about how long they'd hold. When my brother, Tom, stumbled in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I was already knee-deep in one of the ducts with a flashlight in my teeth. "Damn it, Jack," he muttered, voice groggy. "You sleep at all?" "Not much," I admitted, pulling myself back out and wiping dust off my arms. "The fans are louder than they should be. Bearings are wearing down. If one of these fails, we'll be breathing recycled sweat before we know it." He leaned against the wall, watching me with that mix of amusement and concern. "You think too much. They're running fine. Besides, the kids need breakfast more than those ducks need you crawling through them." He wasn't wrong. We'd managed to stockpile a decent amount of canned goods and dried food before locking ourselves in. But meals had already turned into careful rations. I went to the storeroom, lined with shelves I had welded together from old scrap. Rows of canned beans, rice sealed in buckets, flour, sugar, powdered milk, and even some freeze-dried meals filled the space. It looked impressive at first glance, but when you broke it down by calories per person per day, I knew it wouldn't last forever. That thought never left my mind. Survival wasn't just about what you had, it was about how long it could stretch, how many ways you could adapt. We ate together at the long table in the common room. The kids argued over who got the last bit of honey from an old jar while their mother, Sarah, tried to keep them in line. I let the scene wash over me. For a moment, it almost felt normal, like family dinners back in the old house before the world went mad. But it never lasted. Tom caught my eye over the kids' heads. He knew where my mind had wandered. We didn't need to speak it aloud. Supplies would dwindle, systems would fail, and one day, like it or not, we'd have to risk going topside again. That day came sooner than either of us expected. It started with the water. The silo's original cisterns were meant to hold thousands of gallons, fed by an underground spring. I'd tested the pumps and pipes when I first bought the place, but I hadn't trusted the system fully. For the first few weeks, it worked fine. Water flowed, filtered through the ceramic and charcoal rig I'd put together. But then, one morning, I turned the valve and all that came out was a sputtering cough of air and a muddy trickle. I spent hours tracing the problem, flashlight and wrench in hand, crawling through the maintenance shafts. The pump had given out, rusted through in one of its seals. I cursed under my breath until my throat went hoarse. Tom found me sitting in the shaft, oil streaked across my face, the busted pump at my side. "Well?" he asked. I shook my head. "She's gone. I can patch it for a day or two, but it won't last. We'll need another pump. A proper one." He didn't say it outright, but we both knew what that meant. That evening, after the kids were asleep, we sat around the table with Sarah. I laid out the problem, showed them the pump's cracked seal. Sarah's lips tightened, her eyes darting toward the sleeping quarters where her children lay. "You're saying, you'll have to go out?" "Yes," I answered. "We don't have a choice. Without clean water, all the beans and rice in the world won't keep us alive." Tom leaned forward, forearms on the table. "We go together. Hit the old town. Hardware store should have what we need. Maybe even a backup generator while we're at it." Sarah looked between us, torn between fear and resolve. "And if the infected are there?" "They will be," I said flatly. "But we'll be careful. We've done it before." The truth was, we hadn't gone out since sealing ourselves inside. That first stockpile run had been chaotic enough, roads littered with wrecks, abandoned houses, shadows moving in the distance. We'd made it back by sheer grit and luck. Going again felt like stepping into the mouth of hell. Still, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost. The next morning, we packed. I strapped on my tool belt, a crowbar hanging heavy at my side, while Tom loaded his old shotgun. We kept our packs light: water bottles, a couple cans of food, extra filters for our masks, and a coil of rope. Before leaving, I walked through the silo one last time, checking doors, seals, and locks. I paused longest at the maintenance tunnel door. The heavy steel hatch groaned as I spun the wheel, testing its seal. Something about it always unsettled me. Too old, too corroded in spots. A weak link in an otherwise strong chain. When we finally climbed the ladder to the surface hatch, the air grew colder with each rung. I lifted the hatch slowly, the hinges squealing faintly, and peered out into the daylight. The world above looked the same as before: quiet, broken, wrong. We moved cautiously through the overgrown path that led toward town, weapons ready. Every sound made my skin prickle: the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of a building settling. The hardware store sat near the edge of town. Its front windows were shattered, and weeds had pushed up through the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. We crept inside, the smell of dust and mildew hitting us immediately. My flashlight beam swept across shelves still lined with tools, bins of bolts and fittings, racks of plumbing supplies. It felt like striking gold. I whispered, "Pump section should be in the back." We moved quickly, stuffing what we could into our packs: 2 small pumps, extra seals, spare belts, even a box of industrial filters. I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. That's when I heard it. A shuffle. Slow, deliberate, dragging. Tom froze, shotgun raised. The sound came from the next aisle, then another, then more. My chest tightened. Shadows moved in the dusty light filtering through the broken windows. "Infected," I hissed. They came into view: 3 at first, their skin gray and sloughing, eyes clouded and vacant. Then more, drawn by the noise we'd made. Their groans echoed through the hollow store as they lurched toward us. "Back door!" I barked. We moved fast, weaving between aisles, the moans rising behind us. Tom fired once, the blast deafening in the enclosed space, dropping one of them. I swung my crowbar at another, the sickening crack of bone vibrating up my arm. We burst through the back exit into the alley, lungs burning. More shadows stirred at the far end. Without hesitation, we sprinted toward the fields, hearts pounding, the sound of pursuit echoing in our ears. By the time we reached the silo's hatch again, we were drenched in sweat, packs heavy with supplies, adrenaline still screaming through our veins. I slammed the hatch shut behind us, bolting it tight, and leaned against the cold steel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Our breathing filled the silence. Then Tom started to laugh short, breathless, almost hysterical. "We made it," he said. "We actually made it." I didn't laugh. My hands were still shaking. We had what we needed for now, but the truth gnawed at me. Each time we went out, the risk multiplied. One mistake, one slip, and we'd never make it back. And worse, part of me feared the silo wasn't the sanctuary I'd believed it to be. Back inside the silo, the pumps hummed, the water flowed, and for a brief moment, relief washed over me. It was a small, fleeting relief, the kind that makes you feel alive in a place designed to strip you of normalcy. We'd replenished our water tanks, the kids had something to drink, and Carla could finally cook proper meals instead of powdered substitutes. Still, I couldn't shake the gnawing worry that our sanctuary wasn't as secure as it should be. Days passed in a tense rhythm. Rationing meals, checking systems, and crawling through ducts and tunnels to keep everything functioning. Every day the walls seemed to close in a little more. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows down the corridors, turning every corner into a potential threat. I found myself listening harder, imagining sounds that weren't there. Tom noticed too, pacing more, fidgeting with the locks and hatches, his muscles tight, his eyes restless. The kids had adapted better than anyone expected. Eli had claimed one corner of the storage room for his fort, stacked with boxes and blankets, while Sophie spent hours drawing on scraps of paper she'd found in old filing cabinets. Carla tried to keep a semblance of routine, meals at scheduled times, bedtime stories, small crafts to keep their minds occupied. It helped, but only a little. The constant hum of the generators, the ventilation fans, and our own anxious whispers never stopped reminding us we were buried underground, a world away from the chaos above. The next challenge came from the air. The ventilation system, which had seemed reliable for weeks, started to groan in protest. The motors rattled, and the hums turned into stutters. I climbed into the ducts to investigate, flashlight in hand, heart hammering against my ribs. Dust caked the filters in thick layers, and some of the fan blades had cracked, sending vibrations up the shafts. If one motor seized completely, the air quality could fall to dangerous levels in hours. I spent the better part of a day replacing belts, welding supports, and cleaning the filters. By the end, I was black from dust and sweat, muscles aching, but the hum of the fans steady once more. Tom came down to check on me, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're going to wear yourself out, Jack. You need to rest." "I can't," I said, my voice tight with exhaustion. "If the air goes bad, we all go bad. I need to make sure the system works, every day." He shook his head, exasperated, but I saw the understanding in his eyes. He knew I was right. Survival wasn't just about hiding from the infected above, it was about managing every element in this underground world. One failure, one overlooked detail, and it could all come crashing down. Food became a constant worry. Our original stockpiles were stretched thinner, and while we had scavenged some supplies from town, we had to ration carefully. Meals became simple and functional: beans, rice, powdered milk, occasionally tinned vegetables. I rotated cans and bags, making sure nothing spoiled. Every scrap of food became a treasure, and the kids learned quickly that wasting even a morsel was not an option. One day, while checking the storage racks, I noticed something alarming. A small leak in one of the water tanks had gone unnoticed, slowly seeping into the floor below. It wasn't enough to flood the silo, but over time it could ruin our stockpile and compromise the integrity of the concrete. I worked for hours patching it, tightening valves, and reinforcing the seal. By the time I was done, my arms felt like lead, my hands raw from tightening bolts and scraping rust. Tom helped me clean up, his usual stoicism replaced with quiet concern. "Every time something breaks," he muttered, "I feel like we're running on borrowed time." I didn't disagree. That was the truth of life in the silo. Every day was a fight, not just against the infected above, but against the very systems we relied on to survive. Then came the maintenance tunnel. I had always feared it, the narrow, winding shaft leading out toward the old drainage systems. I had sealed it as best I could, bracing the hatch with steel plates, but it was never fully secure. That night, I was in the lower levels, checking the filters, when I heard it, a faint scraping, like nails on metal. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the tunnel entrance. The steel hatch had shifted slightly, a small gap between the door and the frame. My heart pounded. I pushed the hatch gently with my shoulder. The gap widened, and I caught movement in the dim light: a figure, stumbling awkwardly, dragging itself toward us. Zombies. They had found a way in. I slammed the hatch shut, bolting it as tightly as I could. My mind raced. We had reinforced the silo, yes, but this was a weak point. And now it was exposed. I called Tom down to help. We prepared weapons, a shotgun, a crowbar, and makeshift spears from metal rods I had cut from the workshop. I instructed him to stay close, to watch the children and Carla, while I inspected the tunnel more closely. When we opened the hatch again, the stench hit us first. Foul, acrid, the unmistakable smell of rot. They were coming, drawn by our presence, and the confined space meant there was no room to maneuver. I raised the shotgun and fired, the blast deafening in the narrow shaft. One fell immediately, and another staggered back from the impact. Tom swung the crowbar, striking another in the skull. The rest backed off slightly, confused by our aggression, giving us a moment to push the hatch closed and weld temporary reinforcements across the gap. We spent hours after that night reinforcing every weak point, patching cracks in the tunnel walls, and installing extra locks on every hatch. The incident left a mark on all of us. The kids were afraid to go near the area, clinging to their mother when we moved through the lower levels. Tom moved with a heightened tension, checking doors and systems constantly. I, too, felt the weight heavier than ever. The silo was our sanctuary, but it was fragile. Food, water, air, every element required constant attention. I found myself crawling through ducts, inspecting motors, scrubbing filters, cleaning pipes, checking tanks. Every task was exhausting, repetitive, but necessary. We had no margin for error. One night, a generator sputtered and cut out. I ran down to the lower level, hands shaking from cold and fear. The backup kicked in immediately, but the sudden loss of light and hum made the wall seem alive, moving. I patched the problem, tightened the fuel lines, and replaced worn wiring. By the time I finished, I was soaked in sweat, muscles aching, but the generator hummed steadily once more. Tom and I sat in the workshop afterward, breathing hard, listening to the low, steady drone of machines keeping us alive. "I can't believe how much work this is," he said quietly. "I told you," I replied. "Survival isn't just hiding. It's maintenance. Constant, endless maintenance." And he knew I was right. Weeks turned into months. The silo became a world of its own. We mapped every inch, tracked every pipe, fan, and hatch. We rationed food meticulously, monitored water levels, and rotated the generators and filters. The kids learned which buttons not to touch, which areas were dangerous, and which doors were off limits. Carla taught them to help with small tasks, folding laundry, organizing supplies, sweeping the corridors, anything to give them a sense of purpose. Our trips to the surface became more calculated. I would scout, Tom would cover, and we would go in the dead of night, moving quickly, quietly, avoiding the shadows that might hide the infected. Each run was a gamble, each trip a reminder of what we were fighting to protect. Sometimes we returned with small treasures, canned goods, tools, even old blankets or books. Other times, we barely made it back, hearts hammering, packs lighter than we'd hoped. But we adapted. The silo was more than a shelter, it was a living system. Air, water, power, food, it all needed tending. I learned to trust the machines almost as much as I trusted myself. Every squeak of a fan, every drip of water, every hum of the generator became a signal, a message about the state of our survival. And yet, the maintenance tunnel remained a shadow in my mind. I reinforced it constantly, added traps, welded extra plates, and even rigged a makeshift alarm system with tin cans and wire. I hated the sound it made every time it clanged, but it was better than facing the unknown in silence. Every day in the silo was a battle of endurance, patience, and vigilance. We were safe, yes, but only as long as we didn't become careless. Every task, every repair, every precaution mattered. One failure could undo all the careful work we'd done, one lapse could mean death. Months passed like this, a tense rhythm of survival. And through it all, I kept thinking, the world above might be gone, but down here, in our steel coffin, we were alive. Not just surviving, but adapting, learning, becoming something stronger than before. It wasn't a life anyone would envy, but it was life. And we would fight to keep it, for as long as we could. The days in the silo blurred into one long stretch of tension and vigilance. The air was cooler in the lower levels, dank with the scent of concrete and metal, while the ventilation fans droned steadily, like the pulse of the place itself. I had grown used to the rhythms of life down here, the hum of the generators, the drip of condensation from old pipes, the occasional squeak or groan of the steel walls settling. But despite familiarity, every noise set my nerves on edge. The maintenance tunnel had become the focal point of my worry. After the first incident, I had fortified it, welded steel plates over weak spots, rigged makeshift alarms, and even laid down metal spikes along one side of the floor. It was an uncomfortable path to travel, narrow and claustrophobic, but necessary. And yet, despite all my efforts, I couldn't ignore the unease it gave me. The shadows moved differently here, and the air smelled faintly of decay when I approached. One morning, the alarm system I had jury-rigged clanged violently. I bolted upright from my cot, adrenaline slamming through my veins. Tom was already moving, shotgun in hand, as I grabbed my crowbar and flashlight. The sound echoed through the silo, bouncing off steel walls, metal ducts, and concrete floors. Something was coming. I knew it. We approached the tunnel cautiously. The hatch at the far end rattled violently, the gap I had so carefully sealed now barely holding. I gritted my teeth, knowing that if they broke through, we would be dealing with the infected in the tightest, most dangerous part of the silo. I checked my flashlight, my grip tight on the crowbar. The first figure staggered into view, slow and deliberate, arms outstretched. Behind it, more shapes emerged, groaning and shuffling like a distorted parade. Tom fired his shotgun, and the blast echoed like thunder. One of the creatures went down immediately, its head splintering under the buckshot. Another lurched forward, claws scraping the metal floor. I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull with a sickening crack. The sound of bones breaking and bodies hitting steel reverberated through the narrow passage. We were forced to retreat to the main level, slamming hatches behind us and welding temporary barriers across the tunnel. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline leaving me shaking and drained. After the fight, I took inventory. We had lost some tools, a few spare parts, but no one was hurt. The children were asleep, oblivious to the danger only a few meters below them. Carla sat on the floor, holding a blanket over the kids, silent and tense. I tried to offer a reassuring smile, but it felt hollow. Each encounter like this reminded me that safety was temporary, fragile. We reinforced the tunnel further. I welded additional steel plates, built improvised spikes along the edges, and rigged a pulley system that could drop heavy metal debris into the corridor if they forced the hatch open again. Tom set up more weapons in strategic spots: shotgun at the hatch, axes along the walls, sharpened rods ready to impale. It was grueling work, and by the time we finished, my hands were raw, sweat mixing with grime and blood from minor cuts. Life in the silo became a routine of repairs, rationing, and constant vigilance. We developed a schedule: mornings spent checking ventilation and water, afternoons securing storage and reinforcing weak points, evenings devoted to scavenging or planning. We even designated times for the children to play, carving out small moments of normalcy in a world gone mad. Supply runs were the most nerve-wracking. Each trip outside was a careful dance of observation, patience, and speed. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, abandoned shopping carts, and the occasional corpse. The infected lurked everywhere, drawn by noise, light, and movement. We moved at dawn or dusk, when shadows provided cover, and never lingered longer than necessary. The first extended run was to a hardware store several miles from the silo. The roads were overgrown with weeds, cracked and broken, littered with abandoned cars. I kept the truck low, engine idling quietly, while Tom scanned for movement with binoculars. We moved quickly, gathering pumps, fuel cans, and spare filters for the water system. It was while exiting the store that the infected struck. One came out from behind a stack of tires, stumbling toward us with a guttural moan. Tom fired, and the blast echoed in the narrow alleyway. Another emerged, and I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull. The fight was chaotic, brutal, and tense. Each step away from the store felt like a gamble. When we finally reached the truck and sped toward the silo, I realized just how close we had come to losing everything. Back underground, life demanded constant adaptation. The water system, though functional, required constant monitoring. Filters clogged faster than expected, pumps sputtered and groaned, and pipes leaked in the most inconvenient spots. I spent long hours crawling through the tunnels, wrench in hand, checking every joint, every valve, every pump. It was exhausting, back-breaking work, but necessary. Without water, food, or breathable air, none of us would survive. Ventilation remained a persistent worry. I climbed into the ducts regularly, inspecting motors, cleaning fans, replacing belts. Each visit reminded me of the fragility of our underground refuge. One motor seized unexpectedly, sending a shudder through the system and cutting off airflow to a significant section. I worked for hours to repair it, sweat and grime coating my body, hands blistered and aching. By the time I emerged, muscles trembling, I realized how dependent we had become on machinery. The children adapted in their own way. Eli built forts out of boxes and blankets, while Sophie drew pictures of the silo as she imagined it might look in a world without monsters. Carla tried to maintain routines, meals at regular times, bedtime stories, crafts to keep their minds engaged, but the tension in the air was inescapable. Even small noises, a metal plate shifting or a distant groan from the maintenance tunnel, sent the kids scuttling to her side. Tom and I kept watch in shifts. Nights were tense, the shadows lengthening as the lights flickered. Every noise made us jump, every vibration felt like an intrusion. We reinforced the hatchways, welded extra plates, and added improvised alarms to detect movement. But despite all precautions, the knowledge that the infected could appear at any moment never left us. One particularly tense night, I heard scratching near the maintenance tunnel. My flashlight revealed movement beyond the reinforced hatch, a cluster of figures, slow and deliberate, testing the barrier. My heart pounded as I raised the shotgun, firing through the small viewing slot I had cut in the hatch. Bodies fell, but more shuffled forward, drawn by the sound. We had to act quickly, dropping heavy metal plates into the corridor to block them entirely. The incident left all of us shaken. The children huddled close, Carla's hands gripping mine tightly, and even Tom's usual stoicism was gone. We realized that the silo, though a fortress, was not invulnerable. Every weak point mattered, every system had to be maintained, and every supply run carried the risk of death. Despite the constant threats, life in the silo became a careful rhythm. We monitored water levels, replaced filters, checked generators, and patched leaks. We scavenged from the surface when necessary, each trip a careful ballet of speed and observation. We adapted to the narrow confines, the hum of machinery, and the constant vigilance. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The silo was no longer just a refuge, it was our world. Every inch had been mapped, every weak point addressed, every system tested. We had learned to trust the machines almost as much as we trusted ourselves. Every squeak, every drip, every vibration became a signal, a measure of our survival. Yet the memory of the maintenance tunnel, the threat it represented, and the risk of going outside never faded. Each trip to the surface reminded us of the dangers lurking above. Each night reminded us that even in our underground haven, the world outside had not ceased to exist. And so we survived, day by day, task by task, in the steel tomb I had transformed into a fortress. It was not a life anyone would envy, but it was life, and in a world overrun by the dead, it was everything. Life in the silo had settled into a tense rhythm, but we all knew that routine was a fragile illusion. Every day brought the subtle threat of failure, of machines, of supplies, of our own endurance. I had grown accustomed to the hum of the generators and fans, the drip of condensation, the dull ache in my muscles from crawling through ducts and pipes. But nothing could prepare me for the day when the silo almost broke us entirely. It started with the air. One morning, I climbed into the ventilation shaft for a routine inspection, flashlight in hand. The fan motors were grinding louder than usual, belts fraying and twisting. One blade wobbled dangerously on its mount. If it seized or broke completely, airflow to a large section of the silo would stop. The smell of stale air already clung to the lower levels, a warning that the system was faltering. I worked feverishly, replacing belts and tightening bolts, sweat pouring down my face, muscles trembling. By the time I climbed back into the corridor, my hands were raw and bloody, but the air hummed steadily once more. For now. Tom was waiting in the control room, eyes narrow. "We can't keep running like this, Jack. Every week, something else breaks. What happens when it all fails at once?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know we won't go down without fighting." The next crisis was water. The tank we had patched weeks before had begun to leak again, faster this time. I discovered it in the middle of the night, a thin stream dripping steadily into the lower chamber. Panic hit me like ice water. Water was our lifeline, and even a few hours of leakage could deplete the tanks, spoil food, or flood the lower level. I woke Tom, and together we worked with buckets and improvised seals, but I knew the temporary fix wouldn't hold for long. We would need to make another supply run, and soon. Supplies, always supplies. Every trip to the surface felt like rolling dice with our lives. Roads were no longer empty, shadows moved more confidently now, drawn by sound and smell. We scouted before leaving, watching from the hatch, calculating paths that avoided open streets, avoiding buildings where movement might indicate the infected. The first run after the water crisis was tense. We moved at dawn, the gray light casting long, eerie shadows across broken pavement and overgrown weeds. The hardware store was our target again, along with the nearby convenience store for food. I kept my crowbar ready, Tom had the shotgun loaded, and our packs were light but strategic: tools, filters, fuel, and water containers. The moment we stepped out, the world hit us with a silence that was heavier than any noise could be. Cars abandoned in the streets, doors open or smashed in, the occasional corpse slumped against walls, limbs twisted in unnatural ways. My pulse hammered in my ears. Every movement above ground was a risk, every step a gamble. It wasn't long before we found them. Shadows moved among the ruins, shapes that staggered and lurched with unsteady purpose. 3 at first, then 6, then more as we rounded the corner. They were drawn to the smell, to the sound of our cautious footsteps. "Keep moving," I hissed, heart thundering. Tom fired once, a deafening blast that echoed through the abandoned streets. One fell, but 2 more shuffled closer. I swung the crowbar, connecting with the skull with a sickening crack. They went down, but others kept coming. Panic rose in my chest as I realized the alley we had planned to use was blocked by an overturned truck. We fought tooth and nail, each shot and swing precise and desperate. I felt the sting of sweat and blood on my face, the burn in my arms from constant motion. And then, through the chaos, I caught sight of the hatch to the silo, our sanctuary still a few blocks away. We ran, dragging the packs, swinging at anything that got too close. When we reached the hatch and slammed it shut, bolting it with trembling hands, I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. My chest heaved, muscles screaming from exertion, but we had made it. For now. Back inside, we distributed the water, patched the minor leaks, and tried to settle into routine again. But the stress of the run had left all of us on edge. Even the kids were quiet, sensing the tension in the adults' movements. I checked the filtration systems, the pumps, the ventilation fans. Everything groaned but functioned. Every squeak, every drip, every vibration became a reminder that life here was fragile, and we were the only thing keeping it alive. Weeks went by in this precarious balance. The maintenance tunnel, our weakest point, continued to test us. One night, I heard scratching that made my stomach drop. I grabbed my flashlight and crowbar, moving slowly toward the hatch. Shadows shifted, and then figures emerged. One reached the hatch, pulling and tugging, testing our reinforcements. I slammed my shoulder into the steel door, the groan of metal echoing through the corridor. Tom arrived at my side, shotgun aimed. We held them off with brute force, crowbar and barrel and sheer determination. When the last body fell, I sank against the wall, heart racing. We had survived again, but I knew the maintenance tunnel would always be a threat. It was only a matter of time before it tested us in a way we couldn't immediately control. Power became another challenge. The diesel generators I had meticulously maintained began to falter under constant use. One sputtered and died mid-shift, the backup kicking in seconds later. I climbed into the generator room, opening panels, tightening wires, rewiring circuits, replacing belts. My hands were cut, black with grime, muscles screaming in protest, but by the end, the hum of electricity filled the silo again. The lights flickered briefly, steadying after a moment. A temporary reprieve, but enough to keep us functional. Days blurred into nights. Each system we relied upon, air, water, food, power, demanded constant attention. We had learned to adapt, to work together with precision, but the stress of unending vigilance weighed heavily. Even the children began to understand the fragility of our existence. Eli would peek into the maintenance tunnel and flinch at every shadow, Sophie clinging to her mother at the faintest noise. Carla and I tried to preserve small moments of normalcy. Meals were cooked, stories were told, small games played in the corridors. But the shadow of the outside world and the horrors that might breach the silo hung over us constantly. And then, the most critical crisis yet arrived. A combination of system failures, ventilation straining, water leakage worsening, generator sputtering converged. For hours, I moved like a man possessed, crawling through ducts, checking pumps, reinforcing walls, cleaning filters, rewiring circuits. Tom assisted where he could, but the effort was exhausting. Every muscle in my body ached, my hands raw and bleeding, sweat and grime coating me from head to toe. The children were kept in a safe chamber, Carla sitting beside them, holding their hands tightly. I checked on them briefly, whispered words of reassurance, then dove back into the chaos. Each failure we corrected brought relief, but the next problem always loomed. The silo, our fortress, felt perilously close to collapsing around us. Night fell, and the darkness seemed to press against the walls. The air was thick with tension, every creak magnified, every distant noise a potential threat. The maintenance tunnel groaned, the generators thrummed, the water tanks clanged faintly as pressure equalized. By dawn, the worst had passed. The systems were stabilized, patched, and reinforced. Exhaustion claimed me fully, and I collapsed onto the floor, hands shaking, body spent. Tom sat beside me, equally drained. We had survived again, but barely. In the silence afterward, I realized the truth we had all been avoiding: the silo was not a permanent refuge. It was a temporary fortress, a shelter against an unrelenting world. Each day we survived was a victory, but also a reminder that our luck, skills, and vigilance could only carry us so far. We emerged from the lower levels slowly, checking every door, every hatch, every seal. The children, sensing the tension but unaware of the details, ran to us with cautious smiles. Carla hugged them, and for a brief moment, the terror outside seemed to fade. But I knew it was only temporary. The silo would always demand vigilance, always test our endurance, always push us to the brink. And yet, in that moment, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. We had survived multiple crises, fought off the infected, repaired the systems that kept us alive, and adapted to the unforgiving underground world. We were battered, exhausted, and constantly on edge, but we were still here. And being here, still breathing, still alive, was all that mattered. Life in the silo had settled into a rhythm of near constant vigilance, but the rhythm itself was fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. Every day demanded attention to the machines, the water, the air, and the defenses that kept the infected at bay. Every day tested our endurance, and every day reminded us that we were living on borrowed time. The morning after the last crisis, I walked through the corridors with Tom, inspecting each system again. The ventilation hummed steadily, the water tanks were stable, and the generators ran without faltering, but the memory of failure still hung over us like a shadow. I couldn't relax, and I knew Tom felt the same. Our sanctuary, for all its steel and concrete, was only as strong as the weakest component, and we had already seen what a single failure could cost. Carla and the children were in the common area, attempting a semblance of normalcy. Eli was assembling blocks into towers that defied gravity, while Sophie drew pictures of the silo as she imagined it might look in a world without monsters. Carla's presence was steady, her hands always ready to comfort or guide. She had learned, as had the children, that our life here was defined by routine and vigilance, and she provided a sense of stability in a world that had lost all reason. The first hint of the next challenge came from the water system. One of the secondary pumps, a backup I had installed months ago, began to sputter and churn. I traced the issue to a partially clogged intake filter. It was a minor problem in isolation, but the timing could not have been worse. We had just replenished the main tanks after the last supply run, and the infected outside had been more aggressive than usual, making the next run risky. I spent hours disassembling the pump, scrubbing the filter, and reassembling the unit. My hands were raw and blackened with grime by the time I finished, but the pump hummed steadily once more. Tom helped me carry out maintenance on other parts of the system, and together we ensured that water would continue to flow throughout the silo. It was while I was inspecting the lower ventilation ducts that I first noticed something unusual. A faint scratching, almost imperceptible, echoed from the maintenance tunnel. My heart clenched. We had fortified that passage multiple times, welded steel plates, and rigged alarms, yet the sound persisted. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, flashlight in hand, and called Tom. He arrived swiftly, shotgun ready. "What is it?" he whispered. "Movement," I said. "They're testing the tunnel again. I can hear them." We moved cautiously, checking the steel hatch that led to the maintenance passage. The gap between the door and the frame had widened slightly, a subtle shift that had escaped our notice during previous inspections. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. "Get the kids and Carla into the safe chamber," I ordered. "I'll handle this." Tom didn't argue. He guided them down the narrow corridor to the reinforced chamber I had built, ensuring they were secure. I returned to the hatch, bolted it as tightly as possible, and began preparing defenses. I positioned spikes along the floor, wedged metal rods into strategic spots, and set up makeshift barricades. The infected outside were clever, persistent, and relentless. I couldn't take chances. When the first figure appeared, it staggered forward, groaning and dragging its feet. I slammed my shoulder into the hatch, testing its strength. Tom fired his shotgun from behind me, the blast echoing down the narrow corridor. One fell, another lurched forward, and I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull. The sickening crack of bone reverberated through the tunnel. More figures appeared, drawn by the noise. We fought with desperate precision, crowbars, rods, and gunfire creating a symphony of chaos. Each strike was deliberate, each shot a matter of survival. The narrow corridor left little room for error, one misstep could have been fatal. When the last figure collapsed, the tunnel was quiet once more. My arms ached, my hands throbbed from impact, and my chest burned with exertion. Tom and I reinforced the hatch again, adding extra plates and wedging debris to prevent another breach. The adrenaline left us shaking, but we had survived. Days turned into weeks, each day a careful cycle of maintenance, rationing, and preparation. The children had adapted, learning which areas were safe, which buttons to avoid, and which corridors to never enter alone. Carla taught them small tasks, organizing supplies, folding laundry, cleaning corridors to give them purpose and a sense of normalcy. We also began planning for longer-term survival. I mapped out contingencies for multiple system failures, identified potential supply sources, and created fallback positions within the silo in case of catastrophic breaches. Every detail mattered: air quality, water storage, food rations, generator fuel, even the structural integrity of the tunnel reinforcements. Supply runs became more calculated. We scouted in advance, planned routes that avoided known pockets of the infected, and moved only when we were certain conditions were favorable. Each trip was a gamble, each step a potential death sentence. Yet without these runs, we could not survive. Water, food, filters, fuel, everything depended on venturing into the dangerous world above. One particular run to a hardware store several miles from the silo tested our nerves. The streets were littered with abandoned cars and debris, shadows moving in ways that made my skin crawl. 3 infected appeared as we neared the building, stumbling toward us. Tom fired, one went down immediately, another staggered back from the blast. I swung my crowbar with precision, striking the third squarely in the head. Inside the store, we gathered supplies: filters, spare belts, fuel, canned goods. But on the way back, a group of 5 emerged from an alley, drawn by our movements. Panic surged through me, and for the first time in months, I felt the raw edge of fear. We fought our way through, shots ringing out, crowbars swinging, and finally reached the truck. The drive back to the silo was tense, every shadow and distant noise a potential threat. When we arrived, bolted the hatch, and delivered the supplies, I realized how close we had come to losing everything. Survival was never guaranteed. Back underground, the routine resumed, monitoring water levels, maintaining ventilation, checking generators, reinforcing the tunnel. Each day was a battle of endurance, skill, and nerves. The silo was no longer just a refuge, it was a complex, living system, dependent on constant care. And the maintenance tunnel remained our Achilles heel. Every creak, every shift of the steel plates, every faint noise was a reminder of how vulnerable we were. I reinforced it relentlessly, welded new plates, added extra locks, and rigged alarms. But the knowledge that the infected could appear at any moment never left us. The children, now more aware of the dangers, clung to routines. Eli constructed elaborate forts, Sophie drew pictures of our life underground, and Carlo maintained schedules for meals, chores, and education. These small structures of normalcy were vital, they anchored us in a world defined by chaos. As weeks passed, we began to anticipate potential crises. I created contingency plans for power failure, water shortages, and multiple breaches in the maintenance tunnel. We trained ourselves in silent communication, emergency barricades, and efficient movement through narrow corridors. Every precaution mattered, every failure could be catastrophic. And yet, despite the constant threat, the silo offered life. It demanded vigilance, endurance, and relentless attention, but it kept us alive. Every repair, every supply run, every defensive measure reinforced the fragile balance we maintained. The world outside might have been overrun by the infected, might have descended into chaos, but here, underground, we were surviving. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame, was proof that we could adapt, endure, and persevere. And so life continued tense, exhausting, and relentless. But we were alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, we would remain a fortress against the darkness outside. The morning started like any other, with the hum of the ventilation fans and the drip of condensation from the water tanks. But there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake. Tom and I had been checking the systems when we noticed it, a faint vibration running through the steel floor near the maintenance tunnel. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I grabbed my flashlight and crowbar, moving cautiously toward the tunnel. Tom followed, shotgun at the ready. The hatch that led into the tunnel was shaking slightly, as though something large was pressing against it from below. My heart pounded. The infected had tested the tunnel before, but this felt different. More coordinated. More relentless. I bolted the hatch as tightly as I could and tapped on it, testing the steel. It groaned but held. I signaled to Tom, and we moved back to the main level to prepare. This wasn't going to be a minor intrusion, it felt like a full assault. Carla and the kids were already in the safe chamber. I instructed them to stay low and quiet, reminding them to follow every rule we had drilled into them over months of living underground. Eli clutched a blanket, Sophie holding her mother's hand tightly. I gave Carla a brief nod, a silent promise that I would do everything in my power to keep them safe. We armed ourselves, checking the shotgun, crowbars, metal rods, and improvised weapons I had rigged throughout the lower levels. Every hatch and corridor had a defense plan now, every weak point fortified to the best of our ability. Yet the vibration beneath our feet reminded me that even the best planning had limits. The first figure emerged through a gap I hadn't noticed in the hatch. I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull in a sickening crack. Tom fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the narrow corridor, felling another. But more were coming, drawn by the noise, by the scent, by our very presence. It became a fight for every inch of the corridor. The narrow space forced us to act with precision. One mistake could have been fatal. I swung, struck, pushed, while Tom fired, reloaded, and covered me. The sounds of battle groans, metal clanging, bullets striking steel created a symphony of chaos that reverberated through the silo. Somehow, we held them off, slamming the hatch shut again and reinforcing it with every piece of metal I could find. My arms ached. My hands were raw and bleeding, my chest burned with exertion. But we survived. The psychological toll was worse than the physical strain. We were constantly on edge, every sound amplified in our minds. The children flinched at the faintest noise, Carla's eyes were always scanning, always tense. Tom and I shared silent looks that said everything this life was wearing on all of us, and yet we had no choice but to endure. Supply runs became even more calculated after that breach attempt. We scouted routes in advance, studied the behavior of the infected, and moved only when we were confident conditions were favorable. Each trip was a gamble, each step a potential death sentence. But without these runs, our water, food, and fuel would run out. One run to a distant hardware store tested our nerves like never before. The streets were filled with abandoned vehicles, debris, and the occasional corpse. Shadows moved in ways that made my stomach twist. 3 infected appeared as we neared the store, stumbling toward us. Tom fired his shotgun, and one went down immediately. I swung the crowbar, striking another squarely in the head. The third lunged, but I sidestepped and drove the crowbar through its skull. Inside the store, we gathered supplies: filters, belts, fuel, and canned goods. On the way back, a group of 5 emerged from a side alley, more aggressive than anything we had encountered before. Panic surged through me, and for the first time in months, I felt the raw edge of fear. We fought our way through, shots ringing out, crowbars swinging, and finally reached the truck. Back underground, the routine resumed, monitoring water levels, maintaining ventilation, checking generators, and reinforcing the tunnel. Each day was a battle of endurance, skill, and nerves. The silo was no longer just a refuge, it was a complex, living system dependent on constant care. We also began working on longer-term survival strategies. I mapped out contingencies for multiple system failures, identified potential supply sources, and created fallback positions within the silo. Every detail mattered: air quality, water storage, food rations, fuel, and even the structural integrity of the tunnels. The maintenance tunnel remained our Achilles heel. Every creak, every shift of steel plates, every faint noise was a reminder of our vulnerability. I reinforced it relentlessly, welded new plates, added extra locks, and rigged alarms. The knowledge that the infected could appear at any moment never left us. The children had adapted in their own way. Eli constructed elaborate forts, Sophie drew pictures of the silo and the tunnels, and Carlo maintained schedules for meals, chores, and education. These small structures of normalcy were vital. They anchored us in a world defined by chaos. Weeks passed, each day a careful cycle of maintenance, rationing, and preparation. The silo was a fortress, but it was fragile. We had survived multiple breaches, countless supply runs, and constant mechanical failures. Every victory was hard-won, every day a testament to our endurance and vigilance. But the stress was building. Sleep became elusive, each creak and groan of the silo keeping us alert. Even minor failures, a sputtering generator, a dripping valve, a slightly loosened hatch, triggered anxiety. We had become experts at survival, but the mental strain was relentless. I spent long nights crawling through ducts, inspecting motors, cleaning filters, and patching leaks. Tom assisted when he could, but I often worked alone, relying on the hum of machinery and the faint light of my flashlight. The work was exhausting, grueling, and unforgiving, but it kept us alive. The maintenance tunnel, in particular, demanded constant attention. I reinforced it daily, welded new plates, checked for weaknesses, and improved the makeshift alarms. But despite all precautions, I knew it was only a matter of time before the infected tested it again, and next time, it might be more than we could handle. Supply runs remained a gamble. Each trip outside required careful planning, observation, and speed. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, debris, and corpses. Shadows moved in ways that made my stomach twist. We learned to move silently, communicate with gestures, and react with deadly precision if confronted. Back underground, the routine continued, monitoring water levels, maintaining ventilation, checking generators, reinforcing the tunnel. Each day was a battle against exhaustion, fear, and the relentless demands of survival. And yet, amidst all the danger, there was a fragile sense of life. The children played in their forts, drew pictures, and learned small tasks. Carlo maintained routines, offering comfort and stability. Tom and I reinforced defenses and systems, knowing that every precaution mattered. The silo had become more than a shelter, it was a living, breathing system, dependent on our vigilance. Every squeak, drip, and vibration was a signal. Every supply run, every repair, every defensive measure reinforced our fragile existence. The world outside might have been overrun by the infected, descending into chaos, but here, underground, we were surviving. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame, was proof that we could adapt, endure, and persevere. And so life continued tense, exhausting, and relentless. But we were alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, we would remain a fortress against the darkness outside. The morning air in the silo felt heavier than usual. Even though the ventilation fans hummed steadily, I could sense a difference, a tension that had been building for days. It was subtle, a faint whine in the ducts, a slight vibration beneath my boots. I knew that the fragile balance we had maintained for months was beginning to tip. Tom and I were in the control room, checking readings and monitoring generator output when the first alarm sounded. A sudden pressure drop in one of the water tanks. My heart sank. The secondary pump we had repaired weeks ago was failing again. This time, it wasn't a minor leak or clog, it was a mechanical failure. Damn it, I muttered, grabbing my tools. Tom's eyes were hard and focused. We'll have to fix it immediately. There's no backup left. I crawled into the lower chamber, the smell of stagnant water mixing with the metallic scent of machinery. The pump was seized, a grinding, screeching mess of worn gears and rusted metal. I worked tirelessly, removing the damaged components, cleaning, greasing, and replacing where I could. Sweat poured down my face, my muscles trembled, and my hands were scraped raw, but by the time I emerged, the water system hummed steadily again. Carla had moved the kids to the farthest chamber from the noise. Eli peeked from behind a blanket, wide-eyed, while Sophie clutched her mother's hand. I gave them a reassuring nod, though my own heart was still pounding. No sooner had we stabilized the water than the ventilation system began to groan. One of the fans in the upper ducts had seized partially, causing uneven airflow throughout the silo. Stale air pooled in the lower chambers, and the smell of damp concrete grew stronger. I climbed into the ducts, flashlight in hand, wrench ready. The fan blades were warped, a thin layer of grime and corrosion slowing their movement. Hours passed as I scraped, oiled, and adjusted, sweat dripping into my eyes. By the time I emerged, my body shook from exertion, my lungs filled with dust and fatigue, but the airflow returned to normal. Tom monitored the generators during this time, noting fluctuations and replacing worn belts. Each mechanical system demanded attention, and failure in one could cascade into disaster for all the others. The silo, for all its steel and concrete, depended entirely on our vigilance. It was late afternoon when we heard the first sounds from the maintenance tunnel. Scratching, dragging, low guttural moans. My stomach twisted. Despite the reinforced hatch, we had learned that the infected were relentless. This time, the sound was closer, more aggressive, as though they were testing our defenses with a new determination. "Get the kids into the safe chamber," I ordered. "Now." Tom and I fortified the hatch, bolting additional plates, wedging metal debris into gaps, and setting up rods and spikes. I could hear the groans intensifying, a chorus of the undead testing the barrier. The first figure burst through a small opening we had missed, a jagged edge in the steel. I swung the crowbar, connecting with the skull in a sickening crack. Tom fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the narrow corridor. One went down, another staggered forward, but more were pressing from behind. It became a brutal fight for every inch of the corridor. The narrow space forced us to act with precision and strength. Each swing, each shot, each shove was a matter of life or death. My muscles burned, my lungs heaved, my hands were raw, but I didn't stop. Tom covered me, his aim steady, his presence a rock in the chaos. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the last of them fell. Silence returned to the tunnel, broken only by the groan of machinery and the drip of water. We reinforced the hatch again, welding extra plates and wedging debris. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, but we had survived. Back in the main corridor, I took a moment to breathe. The children were safe, Carla's hands gripping theirs tightly. I tried to offer a smile, but the weariness in my body and soul made it hollow. Survival was relentless, unforgiving, and exhausting. We spent the evening repairing the minor damages from the breach attempt, reinforcing weak points, and checking every system once more. The generators, water, and ventilation were stable, but the psychological toll of the fight lingered. We had survived again, but the effort had drained every ounce of strength. Sleep was fleeting that night. Every groan from the maintenance tunnel, every vibration in the floor, every creak of the steel walls kept us alert. We had learned to sleep lightly, to respond quickly, to anticipate danger before it arrived. The children, too, slept fitfully, aware of the tension that permeated the silo. The next supply run was critical. Our food stores were dwindling, fuel was low, and we needed additional water filters. Tom and I planned meticulously, mapping the safest route and timing our movements to avoid patrols of the infected. We moved at dawn, the streets bathed in a pale, gray light, and the air thick with tension. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles and debris, corpses slumped against walls, limbs twisted in unnatural ways. Shadows lurked in alleyways, moving with an eerie purpose. We navigated carefully, silent and deliberate, every step measured, every noise minimized. At the hardware store, we gathered supplies, but on the way back, we were confronted by a larger group of infected than we had seen before. 10, maybe 12, staggering toward us with relentless determination. Panic surged through me. Tom fired, downing two immediately, while I swung the crowbar at another. The fight was chaotic, brutal, and tense. Every movement mattered, every misstep could be fatal. We fought our way to the truck, shots ringing out, crowbars swinging, and finally sped toward the silo. The journey back was tense, every shadow and distant noise a potential threat. When we finally bolted the hatch and delivered the supplies, I realized how close we had come to losing everything. Survival was never guaranteed. Back underground, we resumed our routines. Water levels were monitored, ventilation checked, generators maintained, and the maintenance tunnel fortified. Each day was a battle against exhaustion, fear, and the relentless demands of survival. Yet, despite the constant danger, there was a fragile sense of life. The children played in their forts, drew pictures, and learned small tasks. Carlo maintained routines, offering comfort and stability. Tom and I reinforced defenses and systems, knowing that every precaution mattered. The silo had become more than a shelter, it was a living, breathing system, dependent on our vigilance. Every squeak, drip, and vibration was a signal. Every supply run, every repair, every defensive measure reinforced our fragile existence. The world outside may have been overrun by the infected, descending into chaos, but here, underground, we were surviving. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame, was proof that we could adapt, endure, and persevere. And so life continued tense, exhausting, and relentless. But we were alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, we would remain a fortress against the darkness outside. The days began to blend together, a relentless march of vigilance, repairs, and fear. The silo had become a fortress, yes, but one that demanded constant maintenance and attention. Every creak of metal, every drip of water, every groan of the ventilation system was a reminder that our sanctuary could fail at any moment. It was during one of these routine checks that I first noticed the change. The hum of the generators was slightly off-pitch, a subtle stutter I hadn't heard before. I crawled into the lower maintenance chamber, wrenches and tools in hand, and inspected the motors. One of the belts was fraying dangerously, threatening to snap and disable the system entirely. I replaced it, hands raw and black with grime, but the fear lingered. The more time passed, the more our systems showed wear, and the more likely a failure would come at the worst possible moment. Tom and I spent the day reinforcing other vulnerable points, the water filtration system, the pumps, and even the hatches along the maintenance tunnel. Each weld, each bolt, each tightened screw felt like a small victory in a battle we could never truly win. Carla kept the children occupied with quiet activities, drawing, simple lessons, and games that didn't involve movement through the corridors. Eli had begun to mimic some of our routines, stacking boxes and creating miniature defenses in the common area. Sophie clung to her mother, whispering questions about the world above, about the noises they sometimes heard from the tunnel. Carla answered as best she could, soft words to calm and reassure, but even she could not hide the tension in her voice. Late that night, we were awakened by a vibration running through the floor near the maintenance tunnel. It was subtle at first, but it grew steadily, accompanied by guttural groans and scraping noises. My stomach clenched. The infected were testing the hatch again, more aggressively than before. "Get the kids into the safe chamber," I ordered. "Now." Tom and I fortified the hatch, bolting additional plates and wedging metal debris into the gaps. I set up rods and spikes along the corridor, creating a trap for anything that broke through. The scratching and pounding grew louder, more deliberate, as though the creatures were coordinating their attack. The first figure burst through a weakened section of the hatch. I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull, while Tom fired the shotgun, downing another. More came, pressing forward relentlessly. The fight was brutal, every movement a matter of life and death. My arms ached, muscles burned, and my hands were bleeding, but I could not stop. Tom covered my back, his aim steady, his presence a rock in the chaos. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last of them fell. Silence returned, broken only by the hum of machinery and the drip of water. We reinforced the hatch again, welding extra plates and adding improvised locks. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, but we had survived. The psychological toll, however, was immense. Sleep became fleeting, each creak and groan keeping us alert. Even the children slept lightly, aware of the tension that permeated the silo. The pressure of constant vigilance began to wear on us all. Supply runs became increasingly dangerous. Roads were littered with debris, abandoned vehicles, and corpses. Shadows lurked in alleys, moving unpredictably. We planned our trips meticulously, timing our movements and scouting the streets before leaving the silo. Each step outside was a calculated risk, each moment a gamble with our lives. One supply run took us to a distant hardware store. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional shuffle of distant figures. As we neared the building, 3 infected appeared, staggering toward us. Tom fired his shotgun, and one collapsed instantly. I swung the crowbar, striking another. The third lunged, but I sidestepped and brought the crowbar down on its skull. Inside the store, we gathered supplies, filters, belts, fuel, and canned goods. On the way back, a group of 6 emerged from a side alley, more aggressive than any we had seen. Panic surged through me, but we fought our way to the truck, shots ringing out, crowbars swinging, and finally sped toward the silo. Back underground, we resumed our routines, monitoring water levels, maintaining ventilation, checking generators, and reinforcing the maintenance tunnel. Each day was a battle against exhaustion, fear, and the relentless demands of survival. Despite the constant danger, a fragile sense of life persisted. The children played in their forts, drew pictures, and learned small tasks. Carlo maintained routines, offering comfort and stability. Tom and I reinforced defenses and systems, knowing that every precaution mattered. Weeks passed in this precarious balance. Every system demanded constant attention, every trip outside required careful planning. The maintenance tunnel remained our Achilles heel, testing our vigilance at every turn. Each creak, drip, and vibration reminded us of the delicate nature of our existence. One night, I noticed something unusual, the faint sound of movement not coming from the tunnel, but from the upper storage chambers. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously investigated. To my horror, a small group of infected had found their way through a poorly sealed service hatch. They shuffled among the supplies, scattering cans and tools. I signaled Tom. We moved quickly, silent as shadows, positioning ourselves to intercept. When we engaged them, the fight was swift and brutal. Crowbars and rods met skulls and limbs in a rhythm that was terrifying and precise. By the time we were done, the area was secure, but the sense of vulnerability had doubled. It became clear that our survival depended on constant adaptation. We reinforced every hatch, inspected every corridor, and improved every alarm. No detail was too small, no corner of the silo could be overlooked. Despite the relentless danger, moments of humanity persisted. Carlo read stories to the children, taught them small skills, and tried to maintain routines. Eli constructed new forts and barriers, learning lessons of defense and observation. Sophie sketched the tunnels and the chambers, creating a visual map of our underground world. The silo had become more than a shelter. It was a living system, dependent on our vigilance, skills, and endurance. Every squeak, drip, and vibration was a signal. Every supply run, repair, and defensive measure reinforced our fragile existence. The world outside might have descended into chaos, overrun by the infected, but here, underground, we were surviving. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame, proved that we could adapt, persevere, and live. Life continued relentless, tense, and exhausting, but we were alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, we would remain a fortress against the darkness above. The morning began like any other, though a sense of unease hung over the silo. I had learned to trust my instincts after months underground, and this morning, something felt off. The humming of the ventilation fans, usually steady and comforting, seemed slightly uneven. The water pumps, generators, and filtration systems all seemed fine at first glance, but there was a tension beneath the surface, as though the silo itself knew a storm was coming. Tom and I were in the control room, checking readings and discussing the next supply run, when a sudden alarm blared from the maintenance tunnel. The sensors I had rigged detected multiple points of pressure against the reinforced hatches. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a single breach attempt, it was a coordinated assault. "Get the kids into the safe chamber," I barked, adrenaline surging. "Now." Carla moved quickly, ushering Eli and Sophie into the reinforced chamber, locking the door behind them. I grabbed my crowbar and flashlight while Tom readied the shotgun. We moved toward the first point of contact, our footsteps echoing through the steel corridors. The first hatch had already begun to buckle under pressure. The infected were relentless, pounding and scraping, testing every weak point we had overlooked. I swung the crowbar, connecting with the first figure in a sickening crunch. Tom fired, downing another. But more pressed from behind, relentless, a tide that seemed impossible to stop. At the same time, another section of the tunnel began to shift, small cracks forming along the steel plating. The infected were attacking in multiple areas, testing our defenses simultaneously. Panic surged, but there was no room for hesitation. I signaled to Tom, and we split our efforts, moving with precision. I reinforced the first hatch while Tom covered me with the shotgun. Each strike of the crowbar, each blast of the shotgun, each shove and kick became a matter of life and death. The narrow corridors amplified every sound, every movement, turning the battle into a claustrophobic nightmare. Hours seemed to pass in what was likely only minutes. The creatures were clever, testing weak points, using gaps in the steel to probe and push. I welded extra plates, jammed rods and debris into openings, and set up improvised spikes along the floors. Tom reloaded and fired with relentless precision. Sweat poured from my face, my muscles burned, and my hands were raw, but stopping was not an option. Finally, one by one, the attacks subsided. The hatches held, reinforced, and welded. Silence descended upon the silo once more, broken only by the hum of the machinery and the ragged breathing of the survivors. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, muscles trembling. Tom wiped sweat from his brow and gave me a nod. We had survived the first full-scale assault. But the cost was clear. Supplies had been scattered, minor damage had occurred to the water system, and ventilation fans were misaligned from vibrations. Carla emerged from the safe chamber, holding the children close. Eli and Sophie clung to her, eyes wide, frightened but safe. I gave them a brief nod, a promise that we would endure. Over the next days, we worked tirelessly. Every system in the silo required inspection: water levels, air quality, power output, and structural integrity. The multi-point breach had tested every part of the silo, revealing weaknesses I hadn't anticipated. Supply runs became even more calculated. The streets above were littered with debris and corpses, shadows lurking in alleyways, movement unpredictable. Tom and I planned our routes with military precision, timing each step and monitoring for threats. Each trip outside was a gamble with our lives. During one particularly tense supply run, we navigated to a nearby hardware store. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by distant groans. 3 infected appeared as we neared the building, staggering toward us. Tom fired his shotgun, downing one immediately. I swung the crowbar at another, striking with precision, while the third lunged at Tom and was met with a well-aimed blast. Inside, we gathered essential supplies: filters, belts, fuel, and canned goods. On the way back, a group of 7 appeared, more coordinated than any we had seen. Panic surged through me, but our training and instincts kicked in. We fought through, shots ringing out, crowbars swinging, and finally reached the truck. Returning to the silo, we secured the hatches, restored systems, and reinforced weak points. The attack had left us battered but alive. Each day underground became a test of endurance, skill, and nerves. Psychologically, the strain was immense. Sleep was fleeting, shadows and noises amplified in our minds. Carla and the children remained strong, but the tension was palpable. Every creak, drip, and vibration reminded us of the delicate balance of our underground life. We continued to adapt. I created new emergency protocols for simultaneous breaches, reinforcing every hatch, inspecting every corridor, and improving alarms and defensive measures. Tom assisted tirelessly, our teamwork a constant source of stability. Carlo maintained routines for the children, offering comfort and education, keeping a sense of normalcy alive. Despite the danger, moments of humanity persisted. Eli continued to build forts, Sophie sketched maps, and Carla read stories, teaching lessons about life above ground in hushed tones. These small acts of routine became our anchor in the chaos. The silo had evolved beyond mere shelter. It was a living, breathing system, dependent on our vigilance. Every squeak, drip, and vibration signaled a threat or failure. Every supply run, repair, and defensive measure reinforced our fragile existence. The world outside had descended into chaos, overrun by the infected, but here underground, we survived. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame proved our resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity. Life continued tense, exhausting, and relentless, but we remained alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, it would remain a fortress against the darkness above. The air in the silo had become thick with tension. We had survived the multi-point breach, but the effort had left its mark. Generators were running constantly, water pumps strained under heavier use, and even the ventilation fans were showing signs of wear. Every system that kept us alive now felt precarious, like a delicate chain holding back disaster. I woke early, before the hum of the machinery reached full strength, and began my routine inspection. Tom joined me shortly after, his face set and serious. "Jack," he said quietly, "we need to start rationing more strictly. The water reserves are lower than I thought, and if we keep up the pace of repairs and supply runs, we won't make it through the month without a problem." I nodded grimly. "We'll make adjustments. We have to." Carla and the children were already up, moving carefully through the corridors. Eli was stacking empty cans, Sophie quietly drawing, both children acutely aware of the tension in the air. Carla gave me a tired but resolute smile. Her calmness was our anchor, but I could see the strain behind it. The day began with routine maintenance, but even small tasks felt monumental under the pressure. I inspected the generators, tightening belts, and checking fuel lines, while Tom monitored the water pumps, ensuring the filtration system was working optimally. Each fix revealed small issues: corrosion, leaks, worn gears that reminded me of how fragile our sanctuary had become. By midday, the strain of the past few weeks had begun to show. Even minor vibrations from the ventilation system seemed louder, echoing through the steel corridors. I could hear Carla calmly directing the children in chores and lessons, but her voice trembled occasionally, betraying her fatigue. Then came the news of a problem we could not immediately fix: the water reservoir in the lower chamber had developed a leak. A slow, steady drip had turned into a small stream. Tom and I assessed the situation quickly. Patching it would buy us time, but it was a temporary solution. If the leak worsened, we risked losing a significant portion of our reserves. I grabbed my tools and climbed down into the flooded section, crawling along narrow walkways while the water seeped around my boots. Tom handed me welding rods and sealant, moving cautiously beside me. Hours passed as we worked, dripping with sweat and grime, patching the reservoir as best we could. By the time we emerged, our muscles ached, our hands were raw, but the leak had slowed to a manageable drip. Even as we repaired the water system, the psychological weight of survival pressed down. Each creak, drip, and vibration reminded us that the silo was fragile. Every supply run, every repair, every defensive measure had to be executed perfectly or the consequences could be fatal. That evening, a minor quake rattled the silo, shaking dust from the ceilings and causing a temporary misalignment in the ventilation ducts. We rushed to stabilize the fans, tighten brackets, and clear the airflow. My heart raced, knowing that a small failure now could cascade into disaster. Carla gathered the children in the safe chamber, and I joined her briefly. Eli and Sophie looked up at me with wide, serious eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" Eli asked softly. I knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're okay," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain. "We've made it this far, and we'll make it through the next challenge too. But we have to stay sharp and careful. That's how we survive." Night fell, and with it came another test. From the maintenance tunnel, faint scratching and groaning began once more. The previous breaches had made it clear that the infected would test our defenses relentlessly. Tom and I moved quickly, bolting hatches, adding extra reinforcements, and preparing weapons along the corridor. The first figure appeared suddenly, emerging from a small gap in the steel. I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull. Tom fired the shotgun, taking down another. More pressed forward, a relentless tide testing every weak point. We fought with precision, moving with practiced efficiency, every swing and shot a calculated act of survival. By the time the last of them fell, exhaustion had set in. Our muscles trembled, our hands bled, but we had survived yet again. We reinforced the hatch one more time, welding extra plates and adding debris to prevent future breaches. In the days that followed, we focused on adaptation. I created detailed emergency protocols for simultaneous crises, water failure, ventilation issues, power outages, and breaches. Tom assisted tirelessly, our teamwork a source of stability amid chaos. Carlo maintained routines, keeping the children occupied and mentally anchored. We also began rationing more strictly. Meals were smaller, and water use was carefully monitored. The children adapted quickly, understanding that every drop and every bite mattered. Even in the midst of constant danger, we found ways to maintain small comfort: stories, games, drawing acts that reminded us we were still human. Supply runs continued to be necessary, though increasingly perilous. The streets above were littered with debris, corpses, and unpredictable movements. Shadows lurked in alleyways, moving in unnatural, jerky patterns. Each trip required careful observation, timing, and readiness for combat. During one particularly tense supply run, we navigated to a distant store. The streets were silent except for distant groans. 3 infected emerged, staggering toward us. Tom fired immediately, downing one. I swung the crowbar at another, striking with precision, while the third lunged and was met with a well-aimed blast. Inside, we gathered essential supplies, filters, belts, fuel, and canned goods. On the way back, a group of 5 appeared from a side alley. Panic surged, but our training and experience carried us through. Shots rang out, crowbars swung, and finally, we reached the truck, hearts pounding but alive. Back underground, we resumed our routines, inspecting every system, reinforcing every hatch, and monitoring every corridor. Each day was a delicate balance between survival, maintenance, and mental endurance. Despite the constant threats, moments of life persisted. The children played, drew, and learned small tasks. Carla continued her routines, offering comfort and stability. Tom and I reinforced defenses and systems, knowing that vigilance was our only guarantee. The silo had become more than a refuge, it was a living system, dependent on our constant care. Every squeak, drip, and vibration was a signal. Every supply run, repair, and defensive measure reinforced our fragile existence. The world outside had descended into chaos, overrun by the infected, but here, underground, we survived. Each day we endured, each challenge we overcame, proved our resilience and ingenuity. Life continued tense, exhausting, and relentless, but we were alive. And as long as the silo stood, as long as we maintained its systems and defenses, we would remain a fortress against the darkness above. The morning air in the silo was thick with tension. For weeks, we had endured relentless pressure breaches, mechanical failures, dwindling supplies, but today felt different. Even the familiar hum of the ventilation fan seemed anxious, vibrating with a subtle urgency that made my gut tighten. I had been up for hours, checking systems and reinforcing weak points, when Tom appeared in the control room, his expression grim. "Jack," he said, "we've got a situation. The maintenance tunnel pressure readings indicate multiple points of intrusion. They're testing us again, harder than ever." My chest tightened. We had faced breaches before, but never like this, simultaneous, coordinated, and relentless. Every weak point in the silo could be exploited. I glanced at Carla and the children. Eli was stacking supplies in a corner, Sophie drawing quietly, while Carla tried to maintain calm, though her knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table. "Get the kids into the safe chamber," I commanded, my voice steady despite the fear churning in my gut. "Now." Carla moved quickly, ushering the children into the reinforced chamber. Locking the door behind them, Tom and I grabbed weapons and positioned ourselves along the first point of contact. The faint groans and scratching from the tunnel were closer than ever, a chorus of the relentless undead testing our defenses. The first figure burst through a small gap we had overlooked. I swung the crowbar, connecting with its skull. Tom fired the shotgun, downing another. More pressed forward, relentless and unyielding, a tide of destruction that seemed impossible to halt. We fought with every ounce of strength, moving strategically, anticipating their movements. Each swing, each shot, each shove became a matter of life or death. The corridor was narrow, amplifying every sound, every movement. Sweat poured down my face, muscles burned, hands raw, but stopping was not an option. Simultaneously, another breach occurred farther down the tunnel. I signaled to Tom, and we split our efforts, reinforcing the hatches while keeping the attackers at bay. Sparks flew from metal, shotgun blasts echoed, and the sickening crunch of crowbars meeting skulls rang in my ears. Time became a blur, hours felt like minutes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the attackers fell. Silence returned, broken only by the hum of the machinery and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, but we had survived. The hatches were reinforced, welded, and secured more thoroughly than ever. The aftermath was grim. Systems had been damaged in the chaos, water levels fluctuated slightly, and ventilation ducts were misaligned. Tom and I immediately began repairs, working with precision and urgency. Generators were inspected, belts tightened, and filters replaced. Every failure was a reminder of how fragile our fortress truly was. As we worked, Carla emerged from the safe chamber, holding the children close. Eli and Sophie looked at us with wide, serious eyes. "Are we safe now?" Eli asked softly. I knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "For now," I said. "But we must always stay vigilant. This is our home, and we must protect it." Days passed in a tense rhythm. Supply runs were carefully timed and executed with military precision. Each trip outside was a gamble with our lives, navigating debris-strewn streets, avoiding shadows, and confronting the occasional infected with swift, precise action. One run brought us to a distant hardware store. The streets were eerily quiet, but shadows lurked in alleyways. 3 infected emerged as we approached the building. Tom fired immediately, downing one. I swung the crowbar at another, while the third lunged and was met with a well-aimed blast. Inside, we gathered essential supplies: filters, belts, fuel, and canned goods. On the return trip, a group of 5 appeared. Panic surged, but our training and coordination carried us through. Back underground, we resumed routines, inspecting every system, reinforcing every hatch, and monitoring every corridor. Each day demanded precision, vigilance, and endurance. Then, the moment arrived that changed everything. I had been repairing a ventilation duct when the old emergency radio sparked to life. Static at first, then a voice emerged, trembling but clear. "Vaccine, available, designated safe zones, immunity developing." I froze, my heart pounding. Tom dropped the tool he was holding. Carla appeared behind us, her eyes wide with disbelief. The children clutched her hands. Sensing the sudden shift in energy, I grabbed the radio, listening intently. The voice continued, providing details of the vaccine rollout, locations for distribution, and the promise of immunity. It was real. There was hope beyond the steel walls of our silo. For the first time in months, a wave of relief swept over us. We had survived, endured, and persevered. And now, a chance to emerge, to see the world again, to reclaim life beyond the underground fortress. We spent the next days preparing. Systems were checked one final time, supplies packed, and routes to the designated safe zone mapped meticulously. The children, Carla, Tom, and I moved with careful optimism, knowing that the world above was still dangerous, but no longer devoid of hope. On the day we emerged, the sunlight was blinding. The streets were scarred, remnants of chaos everywhere, but the air felt alive, fresh, and full of possibility. We moved cautiously, alert for threats, but also with a sense of purpose. Each step was a testament to endurance, skill, and the unbreakable bond of family. Reaching the designated safe zone, we were met by other survivors, relief workers, and finally, medical personnel offering the vaccine. The world was far from healed, but it was no longer entirely lost. Standing together, looking back at the silo that had been both prison and fortress, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. We had endured the worst of humanity's collapse, adapted, survived, and now had the opportunity to rebuild, to live again. The silo would remain, a monument to resilience, ingenuity, and determination. But for us, it was time to step into the light, to embrace the world above, and to carry the lessons of survival forward into whatever came next. And as I looked at my family, Carla, Eli, Sophie, Tom, I knew that we had not only survived the apocalypse, but had endured it together, stronger, wiser, and ready for the future.